Going live. Going live. Hi, everybody. I'm gonna pack up a little bit. Seems like I might be here. I gotta try and control the lighting situations. Hey, my gaff person. There, I'm in my sunroom. Just welcome to my sunroom and my beautiful hibiscus. It's been flowering, although I can't see one on there right now. And I have two more over there. And you can see my beautiful starlights. And oh boy, it's dusk. It's beyond dusk. We had a very beautiful day today. Oh, I'm sorry, I know. It's all that snow removal and time outside and ice chop, and I did a tiny little bit today. But yeah, even last night I crashed. It's finally catching up. But snow tomorrow, so yeah, no need to go to the gym this winter. The gym has come to us. So we're going to read in my sunroom tonight because I don't want to bother Don, who's watching his shows in the living room. But we are reading Michael Savage's book, God, Faith, and Reason. Where's my flashlight? Just wait, I'll get a flashlight. I have to control the lighting in this room. I don't know what's going to help. Can't hardly see it. Sorry, folks. Obviously, this is not the best lighting. It's Michael Savage's book, God, Faith, and Reason. And Michael Savage is a radio personality and a best-selling author. He usually writes political books. This one is a book on God, faith, and reason and religion. And he does slide into his political views. He can't seem to help it. I can relate to that. Anyhow, we are now on, because he doesn't really call them chapters, he calls them stories. And we are now on story number 42 called Jewish Gangster Finds God. I'm wondering if he's talking about himself. I think we have finally ascertained that he does indeed come from a Jewish background and embraces closely the Jewish faith, but he's open to all faiths, which is nice. Even Buddhism, which I suppose it has good human suggestions, but it's not my faith, that's for sure. I'm Christian. Jewish Gangster Finds God. I suppose everyone's challenges are relative. I had some hardships in my life, with a father who couldn't be there for me as much as I wanted, and with the loss of my brother Jerome. That was very sad. But there was much joy and love in my childhood as well. My father worked all those hours to provide the kind of opportunities for me that he hadn't had, and I made more good decisions than bad. One of the more interesting interviews I've done on the Savage Nation, that's his radio show, was with a man who'd grown up under much different circumstances and for a long time made much worse decisions than I did. His name is Michael Hardy, and he was the last of the old-time Jewish gangsters. It's not him. Bugsy Siegel was his godfather. Oh my heavens. He was, by his own admission, a murderer. This was a man who grew up in the even tougher Brownsville section of Brooklyn, New York. Growing up in a place like that makes you a hard person. It's inescapable, but there's a difference between being very hard-minded, very tough, very uncompromising, and then crossing that line and being able to cut someone's throat with a soda bottle. I asked him what had driven him to become the criminal he used to be. He said, well, I watched people. I watched these cops come to my mother's house and give envelopes all the time. And city councilmen in New York City and Brooklyn. President came one time. Are you kidding me? These are all thieves. You understand? That's how I grew up. I watched and I understand. Let me tell you, the difference between tough and hard. You can get tough sleeping in the street for 3 weeks. That'll toughen you up. But hard, brother, I've got 27 years in the worst prisons in this country. I'm hard. I recognized the second part of that answer as somewhat circular. He was saying that prison had made him a hardened criminal, but he had been in prison because he was already a criminal. But take note of the first part of his answer, which had started him down the road to a life of crime, was his observation of depraved, corrupt local government. What do you have faith in when you even those closest to you are corrupt and don't give you a reason to have faith? What I have said so many times about the effect of our national government has had upon the population, with the Marxist we had in the White House unapologetically lying to the people about Obamacare, running guns to Mexico, targeting political opponents through the IRS, getting caught spying on innocent Americans after his director of national intelligence said he wasn't, and worst of all, openly condoning rioting in the streets and racial hatred, calling it protest. The people naturally lost respect for basic decency and law and order. It's very analogous to how Michael Hardy reacted on a local level, only on a more national level. It has biblical precedents as well. Throughout Kings and Chronicles, the fate of the Jewish people is determined by whether they and their leaders were faithful to God. Some kings of Israel and Judah were faithful, others were not. The kings who built up the high places, meaning temples to gods other than Yahweh, led their people astray. Ultimately, the Jewish people lost the promised land because they followed bad leaders in turning their backs upon God. I'm not excusing an individual's decision to become a criminal or blaming it on society as some do. But leadership does influence the culture, which translates right down to the individual. With strong moral leadership and a culture devoted to God and mutual respect among men, you will have a lot less people making the choices Hardy did. There is still the nature versus nurture question. A lot of people who grew up in Brownsville did not become gangsters. Is the tendency toward crime born in people rather than something they learn because one's brother could have wound up a surgeon, for example, instead of a gangster, even though both grew up in the same rough neighborhood? Everyone knows stories like this. How many stories my mother used to tell me? Because we'd argue over this. She'd ask me, how do you explain then, in the same apartment, in the same Lower East Side that she was in, one brother would be a cop and the other would be a criminal? How did that happen? The same parents, the same background. We'd argue over nature versus nurture. I asked Hardy if he thought he had been born a hard man. He replied, let me answer that question. Kings and killers are born. They're not made. Great kings are made, okay? Great because they step off their throne and they look in the people's eyes. They don't look at the top of their heads. But killers are made. Now, you want to know the point, the validity of this question, of what I'm saying? I'll tell you what, 6 million Jews went into the gas chambers. 6 million, apparently some of them were hoodwinked, but none of them took the opportunity to kill the last Nazi before they walked into that gas chamber. Just grab a pistol and kill them, knowing you were going to die anyway. You understand? I got in a gunfight in Hollywood. This famous gunfight, a gunfight at a producer's studio. 1978. Well, I got shot. I got shot 6 times by this guy, a movie producer. We shot it out right in front. People thought we were making a movie. I was looking out of the corner of my eye while I'm getting 9 millimeters pumped into me, okay? And the last bullet that came out of my gun, I ran and I started beating this guy over the head. I was hit in my jugular vein. I was dying, okay? That's the difference. If I'm going to die, I'm going to take somebody with me. He was pretty much a hard guy, I guess, already. That's where killers born or made. Michael Hardy says both. I must accept the answer he gave me as far as his opinion is concerned, but it doesn't really matter whether it was nature or nurture. Even a killer like Michael Hardy could change. He could have decided to not be a killer any longer. It took a personal decision on his part to become a different person for him to be saved. In other words, by turning to God, he saved himself. Here's how he put it to me. Now, what changed my life? I was in Khor Koran. Okay, I had sepsis of the spine. Okay, I helped a guy escape out of Donovan prison, a guy named Dave Finney. I got the warden fired. I did it for that reason, to get the warden fired. Anyway, what happened is I was dying, okay. And I made a prayer. I said, Lord, this cop came in and he started making me sit up. I had sepsis. I had such pain in my back. I had a few days to go. I said, if you ever did this to me on the yard, I'd kill you. But now I'm dying. So you're coming in here to feed off me. He said, well, I said, but I'm getting out in a few days. He said, no, you're not. You're doing life. I said, no, I get out November 27th. He must have looked at the computer. I never seen him again. I was dying, okay. I made a prayer that night. God, please don't let me die. I promise on my soul I will change my life. This is after 27 years of prison. Now I finally broke. Just a couple of days after I'd finished 17 years for murder, okay, I broke. But I only broke. But I said, I won't take any vengeance on nobody, and I won't do anything except, I had to interrupt him at that point and ask, oh, whoa, 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 you said you broke. What do you mean you broke? You changed? And here he's inserted a verse from Jeremiah 2, verse 23. How canst thou say, I am not defiled? I have not gone after the Balaam. See thy way in the valley? Know what thou hast done. I broke. Yes, I did, he replied. God broke me. God. Adonai. Adonai El. He's the one that broke me. He broke me. It's an interesting use of the word broke, Hardy said. God broke him. I asked him what he meant. He said, because God comes to you. He sends people to you. If you don't listen to him, okay, he's going to find a way to break you. He's going to bring you to him. And be thankful he does. Because if he doesn't, then you're lost. You go into Gehenna. And I know that. This is the culture that I come from. This is the Jewish culture, okay? He's got another verse in here from Micah 2, verses 1 through 2. Woe to them that devise iniquity and work evil upon their beds. When the morning is light, they execute it, because it is in the power of their hand. And they covet fields and seize them, and houses, and take them away. So let me tell you, Michael, I was born into a war zone in Brownsville, okay? It started out with the Profasi Gallo War. Well, I started out with gang wars when I was a kid in Brooklyn, on Dead Man's Hill, on Crown Heights. Okay, that's where I started out. I went to a school where the principal jumped off the roof. We went to see Blackboard Jungle, and I thought it was a musical comedy. So more happened in a half a day in my school than happened in that whole movie. So God has always been with me, okay, but it wasn't. But listen, he wants you. He wants you to pay attention to him. And if you don't, he's going to cause you to do it one way or the other if he loves you. If he doesn't love you, he didn't like Cain, okay? Cain didn't make out good. I thought it was more of Cain had no affection for God. in that situation. But that's me. It was amazing to me that he referred to the story in Genesis that had had such an effect upon me. He is referring more to Cain's murder itself than his punishment in living in the land of Nod. But we had both been drawn to the same story, and it doesn't seem too much of a stretch to say that Cain was broken by God when he was exiled to Nod, east of Eden. God could have done worse. He could have done a lot worse. I was still interested in hearing more about God, about how God had broken him in order to save him. He continued, I'm going to tell you something that happened to me in Rikers Island years ago when I took my little girl. She was being abused in a foster home, but that actually happened to me. But that's a very heavy experience. But in the hospital in Corcoran, yes, I had a second. In other words, God, in a sense, God spoke to me, and he let me know, listen, you're headed for a hard time, okay? Now you got a choice now. You can either die in this prison, okay, and you keep having faith, or you keep having faith in me, and I'll bring you through it. And I said, hard time. A couple of days after I had the encounter with the CO, okay, who never came back to my room again. What happened is I was released. I had died that night, and the nurse told me she brought me back. A few days later, I was released to an ambulance. They brought me to UCSD, and with the great care I got in UCSD in 1 year, I was there for a year, semi-coma. Okay, I was there for a year. I had a doctor tell me that he'd give me the operation, but I was going to die anyhow. And I told him, listen, I've been in hell that burned the shoes off your feet in the first 5 minutes. I spent years there, but nobody's going to kill me before God. God knows when I'll die, not you, brother. He wouldn't operate on me. I'm not going to give you his name. Let him go on in his career. But anyway, yes, God came to me and spoke to me, okay? And believe me, he gave me an awakening. And he just told me, listen, you got to change your ways. This is a part of history. We don't have much time left, okay? Things are going to happen. There's a storm a-coming. If you don't prepare, if you don't maintain the greatest sanctuary, okay, against tyranny in the world and keep tyrants from controlling it, then we're going to lose it. At the end of his story, he was referring to America. But he and I agree philosophically. When you say you're broken, you say to God, save me, and I'll do better. I'll walk the path you laid out for me in the Bible. I'll turn my back on my previously sinful life. An individual can save himself that way, so can a nation. And once it does, it can bring itself out of the hell it has created on earth and into a more just, equitable, and godly life. I do think that's true. That certainly happened for Michael Hardy. His decision to change his life and his willingness to follow through were what saved him. As he went on to tell me, I've changed my line of thinking, okay? I'm handicapped. I would travel around the streets in San Diego in my wheelchair. People treated me good, real good, real good. I looked at these people. These are the people. These are American people. These are good people. Okay, who would want to hurt these people? I'm not in the battle zone anymore. When you get out of the army, you stop fighting, okay? I'm not in that army anymore. I've been shot 11 times in the streets in this country. Okay? I've had 16 gunfights. I've been in 2 major mafia gang wars, and that's only on this side of the border, okay? But I'm going to tell you something. When you don't need to do that, when you're not a combatant, then you look at you smell the flowers. And I thank God that I'm not here. Listen, I faced the gas chamber on my last case, and I beat 3 strikes 3 times by the grace of God only. And you know what? You don't have to be a fool to sit around and compliment yourself and say, hey. I asked him what he would say if there were young kids listening to the show who might be gangbangers, but who listen because they're different from their friends. Those kids would never admit they listened to Michael Savage. But I thought they might be listening because there was something there for them, for kids like that, tough as nails, in the streets, doing what he had done as a kid. I asked Michael Hardy, what would he say to them? Would he tell them it's the hero who puts the gun down? Hardy replied, well, I would say that. I would definitely say that. But I'd say this also. When you see prison movies, you see 2 hours. American Me or whatever else the prison movie is, okay? If you want to go there, it's not going to be 2 hours. It's going to be millions and millions of seconds and minutes, okay? Millions of misery packed time, okay, in a concentration camp setting where people concentrate on making your life miserable, okay? They concentrate on doing that, whether it be the guards or the other inmates. You walk out, you don't know if there's going to be a shooting. I was there when they fired 18 shots at Corcoran on the yard. Okay, I watched people get stabbed in the mess hall. They started shooting the M14s. Bullets are ricocheting. This is a hell that I can't understand anybody. And you're not fighting for anything. There's nothing worthy. He has another verse, Proverbs 22, verse 6. Train up a child in the way he should go, and even when he is old, he will not depart from it. That's a good one. It's not like what Audie Murphy did, killed 160 Germans in 20 minutes. He did something here, okay? It's not that. You're fighting for nothing, for people, your homeboys. You ain't going to get a card from them. You ain't going to get a letter from them. You ain't going to get a grunion from them. Nothing. You're there alone. Make the decision. Make the decision before you cut that line and wind up in the Colorado River on the greatest rapid that you can ever imagine, and you're probably going to drown in the mix. Make that decision. Stay home. Be true to your family. I've met a lot of good kids in this system. I just came out. Good kids that are going to spend the rest of their life because of 3 strikes in prison. And they got a lot of good values. They just need a little turn. I'm going to tell you something. They ain't going to get it. Because the biggest maggots of the system here are the California Department of Corrections. They want 3 strikes because they want job security. So these kids that could do something, could be something, they need a break. You need to change some kind of learning system. Whether it is okay, but you need to reach people. Waste all this energy and spend all this money on prisons and not schools and not religious training, and take out of the equation of this country. This is one country under God. When you take him away, he's not above us anymore. Do you understand? Michael Hardy had a lot of time to do a lot of thinking. Now we have Isaiah 2, verse 4. And he shall judge between the nations, and shall decide for many peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Yes, I understood exactly what he was saying. We lose our protection, and though Michael Hardy was ultimately 100% responsible for the crimes he committed, we can certainly do things to help future kids make better decisions than he did. It all starts with God. As individuals, as a nation, we must decide to seek him out and to turn our backs on the sins of our past and to follow through on doing his will. It's up to each one of us. That was kind of a long one. I'm going to see how long this next one is because I'm looking at the title and you can't see it. And I'm going to tell you that it also is probably long. We've got 24 minutes. Oh, it's not too bad. I think we're only going to do 2 stories today. Okay, this story is called Loss. I didn't forget. This one has a scripture. I'm not sure if it's to end the last chapter, story, or to introduce this one, but it's called Job 3, verse 2 through 4. And Job spoke and said, let the day perish wherein I was born, and the night wherein it was said, a man-child is brought forth. Let that day be darkness. And this story is called Loss. A lot of people are in pain right now. Everyone has lost something, either dear to them or what they believed in. People react differently to loss. For example, we see the madness of the progressives expressing their election loss with violence and hatred. Protests. What is loss but losing that which you once possessed or thought you possessed? Consider what loss is. What has been the greatest loss in your life? How did you cope with it? Be it of a loved one, a business, your pride, your dignity, your job, your promotion, your health. It's an interesting question to me because loss is part of life. Everyone thinks they're only going to win. They think that every time they throw the dice, they're going to win. They're not. I want to talk about this issue of loss because a long time ago, back in the 1960s, when I was studying for my Bachelor's of Science in Science, there was a popular writer named Khalil Gibran. He was a Lebanese Catholic writer who later converted to Baha'i, who lived between 1883 and 1931. He wrote a simple book called The Prophet. In it, he wrote on love, children, death, joy, and sorrow. My friends and I read and discussed him avidly. It shows you how different the generations are. So many of the young today are numb. They're frightened of life. They're frightened of love, not even knowing what love is or what loss is. Many of them are afraid to get a driver's license or take their place in society. They can't become adults. A lot of people in America are hurting right now. Years ago, I wrote a book, and in it I told you a story called The Yarn Man Gets Cancer. It was about a man in the world in which I grew up in Queens, New York. He was a poor man, as my father was. They were immigrants. They had probably come over on the same boat together. They had nothing. They were dirt poor. They lived 15 to a room. I'm talking about cold water flats on the Lower East Side before it became a hip. It was a slum. 15 people lived in that man's apartment, his whole family that had come over from Europe together. I remember that song in the 70s. Moving on up to the east side, to a deluxe apartment. Do you remember that? Oh, gosh. Well, they went out on the road of life here in America, that yarn man and my father. My father went down his road, the yarn man went down that road. They remained friends for life. The yarn man became wealthier than my father. He struck it big in a certain business that became fashionable, and he enjoyed his wealth. He bought a brand new house out on Long Island while we stayed in our little attached house in Queens. My father did okay, but he never did great. That's okay. He always made a living, and my mother never had to work. She was a housekeeper, and believe me, a great one. It meant a big deal to us children. We didn't know how great it was to have a mother who was always there, who made sure that the sheets were clean, the meals were served. We did our homework and did all the other things mothers do. So the yarn man went on in life and made a lot of money. He opened a chain of wholesale stores, but then something happened. The trend that had made him wealthy changed. People no longer bought his product. He went bankrupt. He lost the house and had to move with his in-laws back to the tiny apartment he had lived in when he was an immigrant boy. He fell from heaven to earth. I'd known him since I was a little kid. I'd always loved him. I loved all my father's friends and all my uncles. I loved everybody. It was an extended family. It was very warm and very close. This doesn't exist in America anymore. It does in our neighborhood. Unless you are in an ethnic community or a very religious community, the sense of togetherness, the close-knit sense is gone. Let me tell you something. It's beautiful when you have it. It was part of that for me. He was like a second uncle, father, whatever. We didn't separate it. And he's got Psalms 34, verse 19. Many are the ills of the righteous, but the Lord delivereth him out of them all. Our own righteousness can be an ill. I left New York, went out on my road, and came back. I left as a young man and came back a few years later. And there was this man who had been very, very big in my mind, who had been wealthy, reduced to sitting in a chair in the living room in which I had grown up on Utopia Parkway, with tears in his eyes. He had a cigar in his hand. He was always a cigar smoker. And he looked at me with tears in his eyes and almost reached out and held my hand. He said, Michael, look what happened to me. Look what happened to me. Did you hear what happened to me? I said, no, what happened, Barry? He said, I lost everything. I have nothing, he said. I wish God had given me cancer rather than what he did to me. I didn't know what to say. I was stunned. I know what to say. You haven't a clue what you're talking about, brother. You do not ever want cancer. Well, I went out back on my road. I went back to my plant collecting my graduate studies. I heard he got cancer a few months later and died. Don't ever wish for cancer. What is this story about? It's about how he took that loss internally and it killed him. He just couldn't cope with the loss, yet he was a cigar smoker, and there are many cigar smokers who don't get cancer. Cancer is a very interesting disease, and I don't want to go into that right now. We've all thought about it our whole life. If we're somewhere in the level of consciousness, we all think about diseases from time to time. What do you think all this obsession with food, vitamins, healthy living is about? It's trying to keep away the undertaker, isn't it? Of course, he increased his risk of cancer with the cigars, but that's not what did it. When he lost his business, his dignity, and his pride, he was hollowed out inside. Nothing replaced it. As you well know, nature's abhors a vacuum, and in his vacuum, some cells grew because that vacuum was not filled. The cells multiplied and divided. That's how cancer grew in him. He made a place for it. He stopped like Lot's wife and looked and regretted the past instead of facing the future. And God turned her into a stone statue. And God turned this guy, gave him his cancer. Again, I'm asking you an esoteric question, which I realize doesn't have much to do with the news of the day. It isn't what people are talking about on the radio or in the newspaper. I'm asking you to consider, what is the greatest loss in your life? Because there's not an adult who has not lost something important. How have you coped with the loss? Be it of a loved one, a business, your pride, your dignity, your job, your promotion, your health. You must have lost something. Humans lose things. Lots of people are in pain right now. People react differently to loss. The Lebanese poet and artist Khalil Gibran wrote about loss. He was a very tragic figure who died young and is best known for his classic 1923 book, The Prophet. I believe he mentioned that. But for some reason, his writings touched my friends and me. We didn't know why at the time, but everyone was reading him in those days. I particularly remember Gibran's writings on children, on joy and sorrow, and on love and on death. They were simply, I'll give you a short example of what he wrote. Your joy is your sorrow unmasked, and the self-same well from which your laughter rises was oftentimes filled with your tears. Wow, that's deep stuff. That's one of the things he wrote on joy and sorrow. What a great insight. Some of it was such great poetry. It's so true that joy would have little meaning without sorrow. Only the possibility of sorrow or disappointment can elevate the human soul to the heights of joy. And only hoping or wishing for joy can give definition to sorrow, which is the absence of joy. Are we not all like a wine cup fired in a potter's oven, burned by sorrow many times in our lives, only to be filled with wine at others? The one poem I remembered the most, I was young when I read this stuff, was his poem on children. We talked about this one and never forgot it. I still remembered it as, I was raising my own children. It stays with me to this day. Here's another short example of what Gibran wrote. Your children are not your children. They are the sons and daughters of life's longing for itself. You are the bows from which your children, as living arrows, are sent forth. I like the imagery of children being the arrows, parents the bows. But both are necessary, but once the bow has released the arrow, it can no longer control where the arrow goes. Everything has been done up to that point to put the arrow on the right path, but now the bow can only watch. Who's ever touched anything like this in his life? Not since the Bible itself has anything this good been written about children. I've read a lot in my life. I've read an awful lot of books. As a scholar, working toward my master's degree and my PhD, believe me, I read a lot of books. Back then, I read a lot of scientific articles. I've read thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of stuff on the internet since then. No one else has ever written about children like that. And he's got a verse, Psalm 127, verses 3 through 5. Lo, children are a heritage of the Lord. The fruit of the womb is the reward. As arrows in the hand of a mighty man, so are the children of one's youth. Happy is the man that hath his quiver full of them. They shall not be put to shame when they speak with their enemies at the gate, in the gate. And so now we're to the next story, which is the meaning of Hanukkah, which I'm not going to go into because these first two stories were so long. And I like to keep this at a reasonable length. Oh my goodness. That Gangster Finds God was a really long one. Okay, so we've read 42 and 43, and we will start again. The next story is 44, and it is called The Meaning of Hanukkah. Good, because I really don't know what the meaning of Hanukkah is, and I'd like to know. Why not? So that's where we're going to start next time. Story 44, The Meaning of Hanukkah. And now it's time to end the stream and go do my dishes, because while I was reading, I was allowing my dishwater to cool off. It was too hot for my hands. And I thought, everything can just soak for a while I read. So I'm going to end the stream, and we're going to leave my lovely sunroom. Goodbye.